The October wind had teeth that night in Copper Creek. Martha Hutchins stood on McCrady's saloon porch in nothing but a torn wool blanket, her bare feet pressed against the cold wooden boards like she was trying to disappear right through them. Roy stumbled out behind her, coins jingling in his pocket, reeking of rye whiskey and broken promises. 2 bottles, he announced to the street, loud enough for God and everybody to hear. Sold her Sunday dress for 2 bottles of the good stuff. And folks looked away quick, Doc Henley studying his boots, Preacher Mills finding something mighty interesting in the distance. Even Mrs. Chin turned her back, sweeping dust that was already swept. But across the street, Sam Bridger sat his horse in the shadows, watching. 52 years old, and he'd seen plenty of men fail their duties. Never seen a man sell his wife's dignity for whiskey money. That blue cavalry coat across his saddle seemed to weigh heavier than usual. Some things a man sees, he can't unsee. Some things he hears, he can't unhear. And some things his conscience won't let him ride away from, no matter how much easier it'd be to mind his own business. Sam Bridger had minded his own business for 8 years now. Kept to his ranch, kept to his cattle, kept to the conversations he had with Elizabeth's photograph every evening at sunset. But watching that broken woman shiver in a torn blanket while her husband counted whiskey money, well, that crossed a line even a grieving man couldn't ignore. He dismounted slow the way a man does when he's fixing to make a choice that'll change things. His spurs rang against the wooden steps, and every head on that street turned his direction. Roy looked up from his coins, swaying like a sapling in a stiff breeze. "Evening, Roy." Sam's voice carried the kind of quiet that made smart men pay attention. "Sam Bridger." Roy tried to straighten up, failed. "Just conducting some personal business here." "I can see that." Sam reached behind his saddle and pulled down that blue cavalry coat, his daddy's coat from the war, the one that had seen Bull Run in Gettysburg and lived to tell about it. He'd been saving it for something important. Reckon this qualified. Martha flinched when he stepped toward her, like she expected payment for kindness. Every man in her life had taught her that lesson, and it showed in the way she pulled that blanket tighter, the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. "Ma'am," Sam said, holding out the coat, "you look cold." She stared at that blue wool like it might bite her. I can't pay you for it." "Wasn't asking you to." Now Roy found his voice, though it came out thick and slurred. "Hold on there, Bridger. That's my wife you're talking to. My business." Sam kept his eyes on Martha. The coat hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. "You're leaving with me," he said, and his voice held the kind of certainty that didn't invite argument. Not a question, not a request. A statement of fact, like saying the sun rises in the east. "Now wait just a—" Roy started forward, but Doc Henley stepped out of the shadows. "Roy," the old doctor said, "you sold her dress. Seems to me she's got cause to accept a coat from a gentleman." "She's my wife." Roy's voice cracked like a teenager's. "You can't just—" "She chooses." Sam's words cut through the night air clean as a blade. He looked at Martha, then really looked at her, the way a man looks at another human being instead of property. "What's it gonna be, ma'am?" For a moment, the whole street held its breath. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for her answer. Martha stood there in that torn blanket, bare feet on cold wood, and Sam could see 8 different kinds of fear warring in her eyes. Fear of staying, fear of leaving, fear of trusting, fear of Roy's fists, fear of Sam's intentions, fear of choosing wrong. But underneath all that fear, something else flickered. Something that might have been hope, if hope hadn't been beaten out of her years ago. She reached for the coat. The blue wool settled around her shoulders like armor she'd never owned. Sam fastened it gentle. The way he'd have fastened his daughter's coat if he'd ever had a daughter to fasten a coat for. His hands didn't linger, didn't take liberties. Just made sure she was covered proper, made sure she had what dignity a coat could give a woman. "This ain't legal," Roy hollered, but his protest sounded hollow as a broken bell. "Sheriff Caldwell's gonna hear about this." "I expect he will." Sam stepped back, tipped his hat to Martha. "Ma'am, my horse is gentle and the ride's not far. You got my word on that." She nodded, still clutching the coat like a lifeline. When Sam helped her up behind his saddle, she weighed no more than a shadow. He could feel her shaking through the wool, but whether from cold or fear or relief, he couldn't say. As they rode away, Roy's voice followed them down the street, full of whiskey courage and empty threats. But the town stayed quiet, folks melting back into the shadows like they'd seen something they weren't supposed to see, maybe something they should have done themselves. The ride to Bridger Ranch took 20 minutes through country that looked different in moonlight, softer somehow, like the darkness forgave the day's harsh edges. Martha didn't speak, just held on light as a bird that might fly away at any sudden movement. Sam's ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwoods, lamplight glowing warm in the front window. It wasn't much, a working man's place, built for purpose, not show. But it was honest, and tonight, Honest felt like enough. He helped her down gentle, led her to the front porch. "Got a spare room," he said. "Clean bed, your own privacy. Lock on the door if it makes you feel safer." She looked up at him then, really looked, and Sam saw something in her eyes that stopped his breath. Gratitude. Yes, but something else. Surprise. Like kindness was a foreign country she'd never visited. The blue coat hung loose on her small frame, and the porch light caught the places where tears had tracked down her cheeks. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles. Roy's anger, town gossip, questions that didn't have easy answers. But tonight, she was warm. Dawn came to the Bridger Ranch like a blessing nobody deserved, but everybody needed. Sam had been awake since 4. Old habits from ranching don't die easy, sitting on his front porch with coffee and the sunrise. Same as he'd done for 8 years running. Only difference this morning was the extra cup on the table beside him. He'd set out 2 cups without thinking, the way he always did. Then remembered. Then set out a third. The spare room door opened quiet as a prayer, and Martha stepped onto the porch wearing a clean blue dress that used to belong to Elizabeth. Sam had left it folded on the chair with a basin of warm water and soap that smelled like lavender instead of lye. Simple things, things a woman deserved. She moved like she expected the floorboards to give way under her feet, like kindness was a trap she hadn't learned to spot yet. But when Sam held out that third cup of coffee, black and strong enough to wake the dead, she took it with hands that only shook a little. "Thank you," she whispered, and those might have been the first words she'd spoken that weren't apologies or pleas. They sat in silence while the sun painted the sky every shade of gold and copper the good Lord ever mixed. The coffee was bitter as truth and twice as warming. Sam's cattle lowed in the distance, and somewhere a mockingbird was practicing its whole repertoire for an audience of wind and wildflowers. Martha kept stealing glances at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't make sense. Men in her world took things, dignity, choice, flesh, hope. They didn't give away coats or pour coffee or sit quiet while a woman found her footing. Sam could see the question in her eyes, the one she was afraid to ask. "What do you want from me?" "Might rain later," he said instead, pointing at clouds building on the horizon. "Good for the grass. Been a dry summer." She nodded like weather was the most important conversation she'd ever had. Maybe it was. Maybe talking about anything besides the shape of her bruises or the fear in her eyes was a kind of gift. After breakfast, eggs and biscuits and ham that didn't come with strings attached, Martha wandered the ranch, while Sam tended his morning chores. She moved careful, like she was visiting a museum where everything was too precious to touch. But Sam caught her running her fingers along the fence rails, testing whether this place was real or just another dream that would turn nightmare when she woke up. He was mending a gate hinge when he saw her stop by the small fenced plot behind the house. Elizabeth's grave sat under a cottonwood tree, marked by a simple wooden cross and surrounded by wildflowers that came up volunteers every spring. The inscription was carved deep enough to last. Elizabeth Margaret Bridger, 1847 to 1870. Beloved wife, rest in peace. Martha stood there a long time, reading those words like they told a story she recognized. When Sam finally walked over, she didn't move away. "Your wife," she said. Not a question. 8 years now. Sam so pulled a few weeds from around the grave marker, hands busy while his heart stayed steady. "Died giving birth. Baby didn't make it neither. I'm sorry." And she meant it, the way only someone who'd lost everything could mean it. She was a good woman, deserved better than what she got. Sam straightened, brushed dirt from his knees. "Sometimes I think if I'd made different choices that night." He didn't finish the thought. Some guilts were too heavy for words. Martha touched the wooden cross gentle as a blessing. She must have loved you very much, to trust you with her heart like that. Sam looked at her sharp. Not many folks saw past his silence to the man underneath, the one who still set 2 plates for supper and talked to photographs when the loneliness got too loud. But Martha saw. Maybe because she knew what it felt like to live with ghosts. "The town says you're dangerous," she said quiet. "Mrs. Chen warned me yesterday when I bought flour. Said you'd killed your wife, and now you collect women like some folks collect strays." Sam felt something cold settle in his chest. "What do you think?" Martha was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, her voice was soft as wind through wheat. "I think a man who talks to his wife's picture every night and keeps flowers on her grave isn't the killing kind. I think he's the kind who carries guilt that ain't his to carry." How she knew about the nightly talks, Sam couldn't say. Maybe she'd heard him through the thin walls, speaking low to Elizabeth's photograph in the lamplight. Maybe broken people just recognized each other, the way wounded animals knew to avoid the hunter's path. "You don't have to stay," he said. "Got money saved if you need to get somewhere else. Bus fare to Dallas or San Antonio, wherever you got family." She laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Family's just another word for people who own you different ways. That afternoon, Martha found the nursery. Sam had left the door unlocked, but hadn't been inside since the funeral. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, and everything sat exactly where Elizabeth had left it. Tiny wooden cribs Sam had built with his own hands, quilts she'd sewn through the long winter evenings, hope carved in wood and stitched in love. Martha stood in the doorway like she was afraid to cross the threshold. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Sam found his voice somewhere deep in his chest. Was going to be a boy. Elizabeth was sure of it. Had the name picked out and everything. What name? Samuel Jr. The words came out rough as sandpaper. Silly, maybe, but she had her heart set on it. Martha stepped into the room then, touched the crib rail like she was greeting an old friend. "It's not silly, it's love." When she turned to face him, Sam saw tears tracking down her cheeks. But they weren't sad tears exactly. They were the kind of tears that came when broken things recognized other broken things and decided maybe, just maybe, they could be broken together. Outside, storm clouds gathered thick as smoke, and the wind picked up like it always did when change was coming. But inside that little nursery, surrounded by dreams that never quite came true, two people who'd lost everything started to understand that maybe losing everything was just another way of saying you had room for something new. The blue cavalry coat hung on the peg by the front door, waiting patient as hope. The storm came in 3 days later with Doc Henley's buggy and news that tasted bitter as burnt coffee. Sam was splitting wood behind the barn when he heard the wheels crunching over gravel, and something in the way the old doctor sat his seat, stiff as a man carrying bad tidings, made Sam set down his axe and listen with more than his ears. Doc Henley climbed down slow, favoring the hip that complained whenever weather was fixing to turn. His medical bag hung heavy in his hand, but his eyes held a different kind of weight, the kind that came from hearing things a man wished he could unhear. "Sam," Doc's voice carried the careful tone of a man walking through a minefield. "We need to talk." Martha appeared on the porch like she'd been watching for trouble. 3 days at the ranch had put some color back in her cheeks and taught her to move without flinching at every shadow. But now that old wariness crept back into her eyes. She wrapped her arms around herself, still wearing that blue dress like armor. "Inside," Sam said. "Coffee's still warm." They settled around the kitchen table, the same table where Sam had eaten alone for 8 years, where he'd signed Elizabeth's death certificate, where he'd written letters to her photograph that nobody else was ever meant to see. Now it felt different somehow, like having Martha there had changed the shape of the room. Doc Henley accepted coffee but didn't drink it, just held the cup like it might warm whatever had chilled his bones on the ride out. "Roy's been talking, Sam, talking loud and long to anybody who'll listen." Figured he would. Sam kept his voice level as his still water, but Martha saw his hands tighten around his cup. "What's he saying?" "Kidnapping, for starters. Says you rode into town and stole his wife at gunpoint. Sheriff Caldwell's got to investigate if there's a formal complaint." Martha's coffee cup rattled against the saucer. "I wasn't stolen. I chose to leave." "I know that, child. You know that. Sam knows that." Doc's weathered face creased with something that might have been sympathy or might have been regret, but the law don't always see choosing clear when it comes to married women, especially when there's men with loud voices telling different stories. Sam felt something cold settling in his chest. The same chill he'd felt the night Elizabeth died. And he'd known, deep in his bones, that some things couldn't be fixed with good intentions and hard work. What else is Roy saying? Doc Henley looked like a man who'd rather swallow nails than speak the words. "Says you've done this before. Says there's a pattern. Says..." He stopped, looked at Martha with apologetic eyes. "Says you collect women who are vulnerable. Kill them slow. Points to Elizabeth as proof." The silence that followed those words was sharp enough to cut glass. Martha went pale as morning frost, and Sam felt the ground shifting under his feet like quicksand. 8 years of grief, 8 years of guilt, 8 years of wondering if he could have saved Elizabeth, and now Roy Hutchins was twisting that grief into something ugly, something that would poison every kindness Sam had ever tried to show. "That's a lie." Martha's voice came out quiet but steady as bedrock. Sam didn't hurt his wife. "Roy's the one who..." She stopped herself, but the words hung in the air anyway. The truth that nobody wanted to say, but everybody knew. "I believe you, child." But belief and proof are two different things in a court of law. Doc Henley finally took a sip of coffee, grimaced like it tasted of ashes. "There's something else. Been going through my old records, trying to help if this comes to legal trouble. Found some things that, well, they raise questions." From his medical bag, Doc pulled out a leather folder tied with string. Inside were papers, official documents with the kind of precise handwriting that came from years of recording, life's worst moments, birth certificates, death certificates, records that told stories nobody wanted to remember. "Elizabeth's death certificate," Doc said, laying it on the table between them. I signed it myself. Natural causes, complications in childbirth. But I also found this. Another paper, older, more yellowed around the edges. Sam's throat went tight when he recognized the handwriting, his own, from 8 years ago when grief had made him careless with words. It was a letter he'd written to Doc Henley the night Elizabeth died. A letter full of guilt and self-blame, confessing how he'd chosen to check the cattle during the storm instead of riding immediately for the doctor, how he'd arrived home to find Elizabeth in labor, how by the time Doc had arrived through the muddy roads, it was too late for both mother and child. "I never sent this letter," Sam said, his voice rough as ground glass. "Found it in my pocket weeks later." I know, but it's in your handwriting, dated the night she died. If Roy's lawyers get hold of something like this?" Doc didn't need to finish. They all knew how words could be twisted, how grief could be painted as guilt, how a man's worst moments could be used to destroy everything good he'd ever tried to build. Martha reached across the table and touched Sam's hand. The first time she'd touched him without flinching. "You didn't kill her. Wanting to save your cattle in a storm doesn't make you a murderer." But Sam pulled his hand away, stood up, walked to the window, where he could see Elizabeth's grave under the cottonwood tree. The blue cavalry coat hung on its peg by the door, and suddenly it felt less like protection and more like evidence of something he couldn't name. "Maybe Roy's right," he said to the glass, to his reflection, to the ghosts that lived in every corner of this house. "Maybe I do collect broken things. Maybe I killed Elizabeth with my choices that night. Maybe—" "Stop." Martha's voice cut through his self-doubt clean as a blade. "I've lived with a man who twists words into weapons. Don't you start doing Roy's work for him." Outside, thunder rumbled like distant artillery, and the first fat drops of rain spattered against the windows. Storm coming, Sam thought, and not just the kind that brought water to thirsty ground. Doc Henley folded the papers back into his bag with the careful movements of a man handling dynamite. "Sheriff Caldwell's a fair man, but he's also a lawman. If Roy files formal charges, Caldwell will have to act on them. I'd say you've got maybe a week before this turns official." "What do you recommend?" Sam asked, still staring out at Elizabeth's grave. "Legally, send Martha back to her husband and hope the whole thing blows over." Doc's voice carried the weight of practical wisdom. "Morally? Well, that's between you and your conscience." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Martha stood and walked to where that blue coat hung waiting. She touched the wool like it was a talisman, a promise, a piece of armor that might protect her from the storm gathering outside in the one building in her heart. "I won't go back," she said, quiet but certain as sunrise. "Whatever comes, I won't go back to Roy." The thunder rolled closer, and somewhere in the distance, Sam thought he heard the sound of horses on the road. The horses came at noon with Sheriff Caldwell's badge glinting like a warning in the sun. Roy rode beside him, swaying in his saddle but sober enough to sit straight when it mattered. Behind them, two of Roy's drinking buddies, Pete Morrison and Frank Caldwell, the sheriff's own nephew, rode like men who'd been promised entertainment. Sam stepped onto his porch, slow, hat in his hand, every movement deliberate as a man walking to his own hanging. Martha appeared beside him, wearing that blue dress and something else, a kind of quiet dignity that hadn't been there 3 days ago. The blue cavalry coat hung over her arm like she was ready to put it on and face whatever came riding up that dusty road. "Afternoon, Sheriff." Sam's voice carried steady, but Martha could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands hung loose and ready, a man preparing for trouble. Sheriff Caldwell was a big man, with gray whiskers, and eyes that had seen enough of humanity's worst to know the difference between truth and lies. He dismounted heavy, like the weight of the law sat uncomfortable on his bones. "Sam, Mrs. Hutchins." She's my wife," Roy called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of righteous anger that came from a bottle. "And I want her back. This man's got no right." "I'll handle this, Roy." Sheriff Caldwell's tone could have frozen summer. He looked at Martha with the kind of careful attention a lawman gave to witnesses who might bolt. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions. Official-like." Martha straightened, pulled that coat around her shoulders like armor. "I'm listening. Did Mr. Bridger here force you to leave town with him 3 nights ago?" "No, sir." "Did he threaten you or your husband with violence?" "No, sir. He offered me a coat and a choice. I chose to leave." Roy lurched forward in his saddle. "She don't know what she's choosing. This man's a killer, Sheriff. Look at what happened to his wife." "That's enough." Sheriff Caldwell's voice cracked like a whip, but the damage was done. The word hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp-edged. Killer. Sam felt something break loose inside his chest. 8 years of careful control, crumbling like a dam after heavy rain. "You want to know what happened to my wife, Roy? I'll tell you what happened." "Sam, don't." Martha's voice carried a warning, but Sam was past hearing warnings, past caring about the consequences of truth. "I killed her." The words came out flat and final as a gravestone. Maybe not with my hands, but I killed her sure as if I'd put a bullet in her heart. Sheriff Caldwell's eyebrows went up like flags of surrender. Even Roy looked surprised. He'd been expecting denials, not confessions. Storm night, 8 years ago, Sam continued, his voice steady as a man reciting his own obituary. Elizabeth went into labor early. Cattle were scattered to hell and back, and I had a choice. Ride for Doc Henley or gather the herd before we lost everything we'd worked for. Martha stepped closer, close enough to touch his arm. Sam, I chose the cattle, and each word fell like a hammer blow. Told myself it would only take an hour, maybe 2. Told myself Elizabeth was strong, that first babies took their time. Told myself a lot of lies that night. The silence stretched tight as a wire. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By the time I rode for Doc, it was too late. Elizabeth died giving birth to our son. Baby died too. Both of them gone, because I couldn't choose right when it mattered most. Roy's face had gone slack, with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been shock. See, I told you he was a coward. Sam's voice cut through Roy's triumph like a blade. I was a coward who chose money over mercy. But you know what, Roy? At least I owned up to my choices. At least I didn't sell my wife's dignity for whiskey money. Now hold on. No, you hold on. Martha's voice rose sharp and clear as a church bell. You want to talk about killing wives? Let's talk about what you did to me. And she rolled up her sleeves, and in the harsh noon light, the yellowed bruises on her arms stood out like accusations. Old ones, mostly healed, but fresh enough to tell a story nobody wanted to hear. 3 miscarriages, she said, her voice steady as bedrock. 3 babies that might have lived if their father hadn't used their mother for a punching bag every time. The bottle made him brave. Sheriff Caldwell's face went hard as winter stone. Mrs. Hutchins? That's not her name. Martha pulled off her wedding ring, a thin band of tarnished silver that had left a pale mark on her finger. She threw it at Roy's feet where it landed in the dust, like a discarded promise. My name is Martha Brennan. Was before I was fool enough to marry him. Will be again now that I'm smart enough to leave. Roy's face flushed red as fresh blood. You can't just... A wife belongs to her husband. It's the law. The law, Sheriff Caldwell said slowly, also says a man can't beat his wife half to death. He looked at Martha's exposed arms, at the evidence written in fading bruises. Doc Henley's been keeping records, been wondering when someone would finally ask to see them. The revelation hit like lightning in a clear sky. Roy's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Behind him, Pete Morrison and Frank Caldwell suddenly found their horses' manes mighty interesting. So here's how this is going to work, Sheriff Caldwell continued, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. Mrs. Brennan is going to choose where she wants to go. If she chooses to stay with Mr. Bridger, that's her legal right as a woman seeking protection from an abusive husband. But, Roy started, and you, the sheriff continued, pointing a finger thick as a rifle barrel, are going to ride back to town and sleep off whatever's left in that bottle. And if I hear you've been bothering this lady again, I'll arrest you for assault and battery. Doc's got enough evidence to hang that charge around your neck like a millstone. Roy's shoulders slumped like a puppet with cut strings. All the fight went out of him at once, leaving behind just a broken man who'd lost the only good thing he'd ever had through his own weakness. As the riders turned to leave, Roy looked back once at Martha standing tall in that blue coat. I'm sorry, Martha, about the babies, about everything. For a moment, something flickered in Martha's eyes. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the beginning of it. I know you are, Roy, but sorry, don't bring back what's dead. The dust settled slow after they rode away, and the silence that followed felt different somehow, cleaner. Like the truth had washed the air, leaving room for something new to grow. Martha took Sam's hand. Really took it. Not just a touch of comfort, but a claiming, a choosing. Now we both know, she said quiet. We both know what it's like to lose children. To blame ourselves for things we couldn't control. Sam looked down at their joined hands, at the way her fingers fit between his like they belonged there. Maybe that's enough to build something on? Maybe that's enough to start again? Thunder rumbled in the distance, but it sounded less like a threat now, and more like a promise of rain to come. The silence after the riders left felt heavy as storm clouds, pregnant with words that needed saying, and truths that hurt worse than lies. Sam stood on his porch, holding Martha's hand, but he might as well have been holding lightning for all the comfort it brought. The confession he'd just made, the truth about Elizabeth's death, sat between them like a wounded animal that might bite if disturbed. Martha was the first to let go. She walked to the porch rail and stared out at Elizabeth's grave, still wearing that blue coat like it was the only thing keeping her upright. When she spoke, her voice was soft as wind through wheat. Tell me about that night. The real story, not the one you've been telling yourself for 8 years. Sam felt something crack inside his chest. I already told you, I chose wrong. I killed them both with my selfishness. No. And she turned to face him, and her eyes held the kind of stubborn certainty that came from living through hell and surviving. Question the devil's version of events. Tell me what really happened, not what your guilt wants you to believe. So Sam told her. Told her about the October storm that had come in like God's own fury, with wind that could flatten a grown man, and rain that turned roads into rivers. Told her about the cattle. 60 head of prime beef that represented everything he and Elizabeth had worked for, scattered across 3 counties by thunder that sounded like the world ending. Elizabeth was 8 months along, he said, his voice rough as sandpaper, strong as a horse, laughing about how the baby was kicking like it wanted to dance with the lightning. She told me to go. Told me, Martha. Said those cattle were our future, and futures were worth fighting for. Martha listened with the kind of attention that felt like prayer. How long were you gone? 3 hours, maybe 4. Storm was worse than anything I'd seen, and by the time I got the cattle safe, the roads were washing out. Had to take the long way home. Sam's hands shook as he remembered. Found Elizabeth on the kitchen floor when I got back. Labor had started hard and fast, and she was so scared, Martha. She kept saying she was sorry, like it was her fault for not waiting. When did you send for the doctor? Right away, soon as I saw what was happening. But Doc Henley was clear on the other side of town, and the bridge was out from the storm. Took him 6 hours to get here, riding through mud thick as molasses. Sam's voice broke on the words. Elizabeth died an hour before he arrived. Baby too. Boy, just like she'd dreamed. Martha was quiet for a long time, processing the pieces of a story that didn't fit the shape of Sam's guilt. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Sam Bridger, you're the biggest fool I've ever met. He looked up sharp, expecting judgment, finding something else entirely in her eyes. Not condemnation. Understanding. You think you killed your wife because you went to save your livelihood during the worst storm in memory. You think 3 hours made the difference between life and death for a woman in labor. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. Do you know how many babies I lost? Sam? How many times I lay bleeding on a dirt floor while Roy slept off his liquor, too drunk to care if I lived or died? Martha. 3 babies. The words came out broken, each one a wound reopened. First one, when I was 19, Roy came home mad about losing at cards, and I said something he didn't like. He hit me so hard I saw stars, and in the next morning there was blood everywhere. Blood and pieces of what might have been our child. Sam felt his heart stop. Jesus. Second one, 2 years later. Roy was getting worse by then. Drinking more, hitting harder. I was 5 months along, just starting to show, and he accused me of carrying another man's baby. Said I was a whore. Said he'd beat the truth out of me, beat me for 3 days straight until... She stopped, shuddered, pulled the coat tighter. Doctor said the baby was a girl. Would have been beautiful. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Sam wanted to reach for her, wanted to offer comfort, but he could see she wasn't finished. Wasn't done bleeding. 3rd time was last year. I thought maybe if I could give him a son, he'd change. Maybe fatherhood would gentle him like it gentles wild horses. Martha's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. I was so careful, Sam. Didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't look at other men, didn't even go to town unless Roy said I could. For 7 months, I carried that baby like it was made of spun glass. What happened? Roy found some letters, old letters from before we were married, from a boy I'd known in school, sweet, innocent letters about church socials and hayrides. Nothing improper, but Roy saw them as proof I'd been unfaithful our whole marriage. Tears were flowing steady now, tracking down her cheeks like rain on windows. He beat me with his belt until I couldn't stand. Said if I was carrying another man's bastard, he'd make sure it never drew breath. Sam felt something murderous rise in his chest. Martha. The baby came that night, too early, too small. Born, breathing, but he only lived an hour. Long enough for me to hold him, to tell him I was sorry, to name him. Her voice broke completely. Samuel. I named him Samuel. The world tilted sideways. Sam felt like he was falling through space, through time, through every assumption he'd ever made about guilt and responsibility and the weight of choices. This woman, this broken, brave woman, had named her dying child after a man she'd never met. After the name Elizabeth had chosen for their son. Why? The word came out strangled. Because Elizabeth told me to. Martha's words hit like physical blows. In a dream, the night before the baby came. She was standing in a field of wildflowers, holding a little boy with your eyes, and she said, "Name him Samuel. Tell my husband the babies know the difference between love and violence. Tell him some deaths are nobody's fault but God's." Sam dropped to his knees on the porch boards, 8 years of carefully constructed guilt crumbling like sandcastles in a tide. The sobs that tore out of his chest sounded like they were being ripped from his soul. All this time, all these years, he'd been carrying the weight of Elizabeth's death like penance for a sin he'd never committed. Martha knelt beside him, put her arms around his shaking shoulders. She forgives you, Sam. The woman who loved you enough to send you after the cattle, who trusted you to make the hard choices, she forgives you. And so do the babies. All of them. They held each other on that porch while the storm clouds gathered overhead, two people who'd lost everything finally understanding they'd found something worth saving. The blue coat spread around both of them like wings, like shelter, like the promise that sometimes broken things could be mended stronger at the seams. I killed my babies, Martha whispered into his shoulder. I should have left Roy after the first one. Should have protected them better. No. Sam's voice was fierce as sudden lightning. You survived. You endured hell and came out the other side with your heart still beating, your soul still whole. Those babies died because evil exists in this world, not because you weren't strong enough to stop it. They stayed like that until the rain started. Soft at first, then harder, washing the dust from the air and the salt from their cheeks. When they finally stood, they were different people than they'd been an hour before. Still broken, maybe, but broken, in ways that fit together like pieces of a puzzle they'd been trying to solve all their lives. The blue coat hung heavy with rainwater and hope. Thunder rolled across the sky like applause from heaven, and somewhere in the distance, Sam thought he heard the sound of children laughing. The rain fell steady through the afternoon and into evening, turning the world soft around the edges like a watercolor painting left out in the weather. Sam and Martha moved through the house like ghosts learning to be human again, the weight of shared truth settling between them comfortable as an old quilt. They didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Sometimes the deepest conversations happen in the spaces between words, in the way two people can occupy the same silence without feeling alone. Martha helped Sam with evening chores, her movements careful but sure. She'd learned the rhythm of the place these past few days. When to gather eggs, how to measure grain for the horses, where Sam kept the good hay for the milk cow. Simple tasks that felt sacred after a lifetime of walking on eggshells, never knowing which gesture might trigger a fist or a curse. Sam watched her from the corner of his eye as he milked Bessie, noting how she'd stopped flinching when he moved sudden, how her shoulders had lost that perpetual hunch of a woman expecting blows. The blue coat hung on a peg by the barn door, drying slow in the humid air, and every time Martha passed it, she'd touch the wool like it was a talisman. They ate supper by lamplight while rain drummed against the windows, beef stew and cornbread that tasted better for being shared. Martha had learned Sam's habits, how he liked his coffee strong enough to wake the dead, how he always left room for seconds even when he was full, how he said grace quiet but meant it deep. After the dishes were washed and put away, they settled in the front room like they'd been doing it for years instead of days. Sam had built up the fire against the evening chill, and the light danced across Martha's face as she mended one of his shirts, the sleeve torn when he'd caught it on barbed wire that morning. Her stitches were small and even, the work of a woman who'd learned to make things last. Sam sat in his leather chair reading yesterday's newspaper, but his eyes kept drifting to the mantelpiece where Elizabeth's photograph watched over them both. Strange how that picture looked different now. Before, it had seemed like an accusation, a reminder of his failures. Tonight it looked almost peaceful, like Elizabeth was content to see her husband learning to live again. She was beautiful, Martha said, without looking up from her sewing. Elizabeth, you can see the kindness in her eyes. She was. Sam folded the paper, set it aside. Laughed like music, that woman. Could find joy in the smallest things. First wildflowers in spring, baby calves taking their first steps, the way morning light looked through the kitchen window. She loved you very much. It wasn't a question. I thought so, most days. Sam's voice carried the weight of old wonder, like he still couldn't quite believe he'd been worthy of such grace. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me, and she'd smile, like she knew secrets about me I didn't know myself. Good secrets. Martha tied off her thread, held up the mended shirt to check her work. What would she think of me being here? Sam considered the question with the care it deserved. In the firelight, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her face soft with concentration, Martha looked like she belonged in this room, in this life. In the warm circle of light that kept the darkness at bay. I think she'd be glad, he said finally. Elizabeth hated seeing things suffer, couldn't abide cruelty in any form. Remember telling me once that God put us here to tend each other's wounds, not to make new ones. Martha set the shirt aside, touched her belly where 3 children had briefly lived and died. I used to talk to them, the babies, after they were gone. Foolish, maybe, but it helped. Not foolish at all. Sam's voice was gentle as rain on leaves. I still talk to Elizabeth most evenings. Tell her about the day, ask her advice about things that puzzle me. Sometimes I swear I can hear her voice in the wind. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside, The storm was gentling into the kind of soft rain that soaked deep into thirsty ground, the kind farmers prayed for during drought years. It was the sound of blessing, of grace falling free from heaven. "What did you tell her tonight?" Martha asked. "About today, I mean." Sam smiled, the first genuine smile Martha had seen from him. Told her I finally understood. About the guilt, about the babies, about how love isn't something you lose when somebody dies. It just changes shape, becomes something different, but still real. Martha nodded like she knew exactly what he meant. Maybe she did. Maybe broken hearts spoke a language all their own, full of silences that carried more meaning than words. The blue coat hung by the door, patient as hope. In the morning, there would be choices to make, decisions about what came next, practical matters that couldn't be solved with shared sorrow and gentle understanding. But tonight, in the circle of firelight, two people who'd lost everything sat together and discovered that sometimes losing everything was just another way of saying you had room for something new. Sam reached for Elizabeth's photograph, held it gentle as a prayer. For 8 years, he'd said goodnight to that picture, like she might answer back. Tonight, for the first time, he simply said, "Thank you." Martha understood. In the morning, she would plant flowers on Elizabeth's grave, not to replace the woman who'd been, but to honor the love that remained. Tonight, though, she simply reached across the space between their chairs and took Sam's free hand. The fire settled into coals, the rain softened to whispers, and somewhere in the walls of the old house, the ghosts of children who'd never drawn breath seemed to sigh with something that might have been peace. The trouble came back 5 days later, riding hard through the morning mist like Judgment Day itself. Martha was hanging wash on the line behind the house when she heard the thunder of hooves, and something in the rhythm, too many horses moving too fast, made her blood run cold. She dropped the wet sheet back in the basket and ran for the house, calling Sam's name. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, coffee cup in one hand, but the look on her face had him setting it down and reaching for the rifle that hung over the mantel. "How many?" he asked, checking the Winchester's load with practiced hands. Martha peered through the front window, counting riders through the dust cloud. 8, maybe 10. Roy's with them, and her voice caught, and Sheriff Caldwell. But these weren't the same men who'd ridden out defeated 5 days ago. Roy sat his horse straighter now, flanked by his brother Jake and 2 cousins from over in Millerville. Behind them rode 4 men Martha didn't recognize, hard-faced strangers with the kind of guns that weren't meant for hunting deer. Sam stepped onto the porch with Martha beside him, the blue cavalry coat draped over her arm like a battle standard. The morning air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes, and somewhere in the distance a mockingbird fell silent mid-song. Sheriff Caldwell rode forward, but his badge carried less authority than it had before. His face was gray as ash, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like a man reading his own death warrant. "Sam, Mrs. Brennan." He stumbled over her chosen name. "I'm sorry to say we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" Sam's voice stayed level, but Martha could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his finger rested easy near the rifle's trigger. "Judge Morrison came through town yesterday. Roy here filed a formal complaint, and the judge issued a warrant." Sheriff Caldwell pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket like it burned his fingers. "Says Mrs. Brennan is to be returned to her legal husband pending a full investigation." Roy's face split with a grin ugly as sin. "Told you I'd get her back, Bridger. Law's the law, and a wife belongs to her husband, even when that husband beats her half to death." Martha's voice cut through the morning air sharp as a blade. She stepped forward, still wearing that blue dress, but standing tall as a queen. "Even when he kills babies with his fists? A man's got rights," one of Roy's cousins called out. "Got the right to discipline his woman when she needs it." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Sam felt something dark and cold settle in his chest. These weren't lawmen come to serve justice. These were wolves in legal clothing, using the law's authority to legitimize cruelty. "Sheriff," Sam said careful, "you know what this man did to her? You saw the bruises." "I know a lot of things, Sam, but knowing and proving are different animals." Sheriff Caldwell's voice carried the weariness of a man caught between duty and conscience. "Judge Morrison says without formal charges filed at the time of the alleged abuse, it's just he said, she said. And the law says a husband has the right to reclaim his wife." What if she doesn't want to be reclaimed?" Martha asked, and her voice held steady as bedrock, despite the fear Sam could see in her eyes. Jake Hutchins laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Don't matter what you want, sister. You're married property, same as a horse or a cow. Man owns what he owns." That's when Sam understood. This wasn't about law or marriage or even Roy's wounded pride. This was about power, the kind of power that let men treat women like livestock, that turned love into ownership and protection into control. The kind of power that had killed 3 babies and would kill Martha slow if she went back. "She's not going anywhere," Sam said, and his words carried the finality of stone. "Now, Sam," Sheriff Caldwell started. No. Sam stepped forward, rifle held loose but ready. I've stood by and watched enough evil in my lifetime. Watched my wife die while I was off saving cattle. Watched this woman bleed for years while decent folks looked the other way. Not anymore. Roy's face flushed red as fresh blood. You can't stop the law, Bridger. Maybe not, but I can stop you. Sam's voice was quiet as a grave, but it carried across the yard like thunder. You want her back, Roy? You'll have to come through me. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut glass. Even the hired guns looked uncertain, probably wondering if they'd signed on to kill a man over a woman they'd never met. Sheriff Caldwell sat his horse like a man watching his worst nightmares come true. Then Martha stepped forward. She walked past Sam, past the rifle, past the safety of the porch, and stood in the middle of the yard facing 10 mounted men with nothing but courage and that blue coat for armor. When she spoke, her voice carried clear as a church bell. My name is Martha Brennan. I am 28 years old, and I choose where I belong. She pulled off the tattered wedding ring she'd worn for 7 years of hell and threw it at Roy's feet. I choose to stay with a man who offers protection without price, kindness without cruelty, strength without violence. You can't choose. Roy's voice cracked like a whip. You're my wife. I was your victim. Martha's words fell like hammer blows. But I'm not anymore. And if you try to take me back, if you touch one hair on Sam Bridger's head, I'll tell everyone in 3 counties about the babies. About how you beat a pregnant woman until she bled our children to death on a dirt floor. The color drained from Roy's face like water from a broken bucket. Around him, his supporters shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Even hired killers had mothers, had sisters, had lines they wouldn't cross. She's lying, Roy whispered, but the words carried no conviction. Doc Henley's got records, Martha continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Medical records, death certificates, testimony from the women who cleaned up the blood. After you finished your discipline, you want to drag this into a courtroom? Roy, you want the whole world to know what kind of man you really are? Sheriff Caldwell cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice carried new authority. Maybe we should reconsider this situation. If there's evidence of assault, there's no evidence. Roy's voice rose to a shriek. Just lies from a hysterical woman. Then you won't mind if we postpone this warrant, the sheriff said, folding the paper and tucking it back into his vest. Give folks time to collect their thoughts, speak to witnesses. The hired guns looked at each other, then at Roy, then at the money they probably weren't going to earn today. One by one, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving Roy with just his family and his rage. Martha walked back to the porch, took Sam's offered hand, and together they watched the last of their enemies retreat into the morning mist. The blue coat settled around her shoulders like a benediction, and for the first time since she was 19 years old, Martha Brennan knew she was free. Reversal number 5, saving others eats or redemption. Sam had thought protection meant fighting for someone. Instead, he learned it meant giving them the strength to fight for themselves. Martha had thought freedom meant being rescued. Instead, she discovered it meant rescuing herself. In the end, the greatest sacrifice wasn't blood or bullets. It was pride, fear, and the comfortable lie that someone else could save you from your own life. The silence that followed Roy's retreat felt different than any quiet Sam had known. Not the hollow silence of loss that had haunted his house for 8 years. Not the fearful silence of victims holding their breath. This was the silence of justice served, of truth finally given room to breathe, of 2 people who'd found their voices when it mattered most. Martha stood on the porch wearing that blue cavalry coat like a queen's robe, watching the dust settle where 10 mounted men had tried to steal her freedom and failed. Her hand was still in Sam's, steady and warm, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held something he'd never seen there before. Peace. It's over, she said, but her voice held wonder, like she couldn't quite believe the words herself. Yes, Sam agreed. It's over. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. Roy might be defeated, but defeated men sometimes came back desperate, and desperate men did desperate things. Still, for now, in this moment, they were safe. They were free. They were, Mr. Bridger, Mrs. Brennan, a voice called from the road, and they looked up to see Doc Henley's buggy approaching at a pace that suggested good news for once. Behind him rode Preacher Mills, and to Sam's surprise, Mrs. Chin from the general store, her usually stern face split with what might have been a smile. Doc Henley climbed down from his buggy with the careful movements of a man whose bones had seen too many winters, but his eyes sparkled with something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Thought you might want to know. Sheriff Caldwell just tore up that warrant. Seems Judge Morrison was operating on incomplete information. Mrs. Chin stepped forward, clutching a carpet bag that looked heavy enough to hold secrets. When I heard what was happening, I brought something that might interest you folks. She opened the bag and pulled out a collection of papers, letters, and what looked like official documents. Roy Hutchins ain't the only one who's been keeping records. Martha felt her heart skip. What kind of records? The kind that prove you ain't the first woman he's nearly killed. Mrs. Chin's voice carried the grim satisfaction of justice long delayed. My late sister, God rest her soul, was married to Roy's older brother Jake. Before she died, she wrote down everything. Every beating, every threat, every baby lost to his fists. Hid the papers with me before he killed her outright. The world tilted sideways. Sam felt Martha's hand tighten in his as the implications sank in. Jake killed his wife? As sure as if he'd put a gun to her head. Beat her so bad one winter night that she took pneumonia and never recovered. But before she died, she made me promise to speak up if any other woman was in danger. Mrs. Chin's eyes were hard as flint. Been waiting 20 years for the right moment. Doc Henley nodded grimly. I've been keeping my own records, medical evidence going back to when Martha first married Roy. Broken ribs, black eyes, suspicious accidents that happen too regular to be chance. Add that to what Mrs. Chin's got, and Roy Hutchins won't be bothering anybody ever again. Preacher Mills stepped forward, his usually gentle face stern with righteous anger. Sheriff's already got warrants out for Roy and Jake both. Assault, battery, and in Jake's case, suspected murder. They'll be running from the law instead of hiding behind it. Martha sank into the porch chair like her legs couldn't hold her anymore. 7 years of terror, 7 years of believing she deserved the beatings, 7 years of thinking she was trapped forever, and all along, there had been people willing to help if they'd just known how to reach her. Why now? She whispered. Why didn't you speak up before? Mrs. Chin's face softened. Because you never asked for help before, child. Never stood up and said no more. The law don't help women who won't help themselves. That's the sad truth of it. But when you threw that ring in the dirt and claimed your own name, that's when we knew you were ready to fight. Sam looked at the papers in Mrs. Chin's hands, evidence of a pattern of violence that went back decades, proof that Martha's suffering hadn't been unique or deserved. What happens now? Now? Doc Henley smiled, the first genuine smile Sam had seen from the old man in months. Now Martha Brennan is officially free. No more marriage, no more legal claims, no more men with badges coming to drag her back to hell. And Roy? Roy's got bigger problems than a runaway wife. Judge Morrison's issued federal warrants based on this evidence. Seems beating women to death crosses state lines when you're doing it systematic-like. The doctor's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who'd seen justice delayed, but not denied. He'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. Martha stood slowly, walked to where the blue cavalry coat hung on its peg by the door. She touched the wool gentle, like greeting an old friend. This coat's seen me through the worst and best moments of my life, she said. Kept me warm when I was cold, gave me courage when I was afraid, made me feel worthy when I thought I was worthless. She turned to Sam, and in her eyes, he saw the woman she'd always been underneath the fear. Strong, kind, unbroken, despite everything Roy had tried to break. But I don't need it to protect me anymore. Sam understood. The blue coat had been armor when Martha needed armor, shelter when she needed shelter, symbol when she needed symbols. But Martha Brennan, standing on this porch in the afternoon sunlight, wasn't the same broken woman who'd shivered in a torn blanket 5 days ago. She'd found her own strength, her own voice, her own capacity to choose her life. What will you do with it? He asked. Martha smiled, and the sight hit Sam like sunrise after the longest night. I think I'll hang it right here by the door, not as protection, but as a reminder. A reminder that sometimes the best armor is knowing you don't need armor at all. Mrs. Chin nodded approvingly. Smart girl. Took me 40 years to learn that lesson. And as the afternoon wore on and their visitors prepared to leave, Sam found himself studying Martha's face in the golden light. The fear lines were smoothing out, the perpetual tension leaving her shoulders, the way she held her head higher than she had when she first arrived. She was becoming herself again, or maybe for the first time. Doc Henley paused at his buggy, looked back at them standing together on the porch. You know, Sam, Elizabeth would be proud of both of you. After they left, Sam and Martha sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of hope. The blue coat hung patient by the door, transformed one final time from symbol of need to symbol of strength, from armor to artifact, from desperation to victory. The third appearance of the blue coat was complete. No longer grief, no longer hope, but redemption itself made manifest in wool and brass buttons and the courage to choose freedom over fear. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices, its own chances for joy and sorrow. But tonight, Martha Brennan was free, and Sam Bridger had learned that sometimes the greatest rescue was letting someone save themselves. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and possibility, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like applause from heaven itself. 3 weeks later, Martha learned that Sam Bridger talked to his cattle. She discovered this on a Tuesday morning while hanging laundry, when she heard his voice drifting from the south pasture, where he was mending fence. At first, she thought someone had ridden up, maybe Doc Henley with news, or Preacher Mills with an invitation to Sunday dinner. But when she looked, there was only Sam, in a dozen head of beef cattle, and he was having what sounded like a perfectly serious conversation with a particularly ornery bull named Hannibal. "Now see here, you cantankerous old cuss," Sam was saying, his voice carrying the patient tone of a man explaining something to a difficult child. "That fence post is there for your own good. Keep wandering off and you'll end up as steaks in Millerville. And then what'll the ladies think? Bunch of widows with no one to complain about." Martha pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a laugh. In all the time she'd known him, through crisis and confession, through tears and terror, she'd never heard Sam sound so ordinary, so peacefully, wonderfully ordinary. Hannibal snorted and pawed the ground, apparently unimpressed by Sam's logic. "Don't you sass me," Sam continued, pointing his hammer at the bull like a schoolmarm with a pointer. "I've been putting up with your attitude for 3 years, and I'll be switched if I'm going to let a half-ton walking pot roast get the better of me." That did it. Martha erupted in laughter, real laughter, the kind that bubbled up from somewhere deep and joyful and free. It was the first time she'd laughed like that since she could remember. Sam looked up at the sound, and the expression on his face was worth the price of admission. He'd been caught red-handed talking to livestock, and the tips of his ears turned red as autumn leaves. "How long have you been eavesdropping?" he called out, trying to sound stern, but failing spectacularly. "Long enough to know you've got strong opinions about Hannibal's wandering habits?" Martha called back, still giggling. "Do all your cattle get lectures, or is he special?" Sam climbed through the fence and walked toward the house, carrying his tools and what remained of his dignity. "Man's got to communicate with his business partners," he said with mock seriousness. "These cattle and I have an understanding." What kind of understanding?" "They provide beef, I provide commentary on their life choices. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." Martha hung the last shirt on the line and turned to face him, still smiling. "And what does Hannibal think of your commentary?" "Hannibal thinks I'm an interfering old fool who doesn't know the first thing about being a bull. He's probably right." Sam's grin was boyish and unguarded, and Martha realized she was seeing yet another side of this complicated man, the side that found humor in simple things that could be silly and self-deprecating and utterly charming. Elizabeth must have loved this, Martha said without thinking, then caught herself. But instead of the shadow that usually crossed Sam's face at his wife's name, he smiled wider. "She did. Used to say I could talk the ear off a cornstalk, if I set my mind to it. Caught me having a full philosophical discussion with the chickens once about whether the rooster was living up to his responsibilities." His eyes crinkled at the memory. She laughed so hard she had to sit down, and it was the first time Sam had mentioned Elizabeth with pure joy instead of pain, and Martha felt something warm settle in her chest. Progress, she thought. Healing that didn't require forgetting, just softening the sharp edges of grief until they became something bearable. "What profound insights did the chickens offer?" she asked. They felt the rooster was all crow and no substance, very pointed in their criticism. Sam set his tools on the porch and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot Martha kept warm on the stove. "What about you? Ever find yourself talking to animals?" Martha considered this, head tilted like she was weighing a serious question. "I used to talk to Roy's old hound dog. Poor thing was the only other living creature in that house that understood what it felt like to get kicked for no good reason." The words should have been bitter, but they came out matter-of-fact, even slightly amused. Another sign of healing, the ability to speak of the past without drowning in it. "What did you and the dog discuss?" "Escape plans, mostly. He was smarter than me, though. He actually ran away." Martha's smile held no self-pity, just rueful acknowledgement of what had been. "Found out later he'd been adopted by a family in the next county, living like a king, from what I heard. Smart dog, very smart dog." They settled into the comfortable rhythm that had developed between them, Sam reading the newspaper while Martha mended clothes, both of them existing in the same space without feeling crowded or watched or judged. It was, Martha thought, the most peaceful life she'd ever known. "Sam," she said after a while. "Yes?" "Tomorrow, I'm going to introduce myself to your chickens. See if they're as philosophical as you claim." Sam looked up from his paper, eyes twinkling. "Be careful. That rooster's got some strong opinions about women who don't show proper respect for his authority." "Then he and I are definitely going to have words." Outside, Hannibal lowed like he was offering commentary on the conversation, and somewhere in the kitchen, the coffee pot bubbled with domestic contentment. The blue coat hung by the door, no longer needed but still honored, a reminder of storms weathered and battles won. For the first time in years, the future felt full of possibility instead of dread. Spring came early that year, arriving on a morning that tasted like rain and new beginnings. Martha woke before dawn, as had become her custom, and found Sam already on the porch with coffee and the sunrise. But today was different. Today, she carried wildflower seeds in her apron pocket. They walked to Elizabeth's grave together, their footsteps quiet on ground soft with morning dew. The wooden cross stood weathered but strong under the cottonwood tree, and the volunteer flowers that had grown there for 8 years nodded in the gentle breeze like old friends, offering welcome. Martha knelt and began to work the soil with her hands, breaking up the earth around the grave's border. Sam watched in silence, understanding without words what she was doing. Not replacing, not erasing, honoring. She would have liked these, Martha said, sprinkling seeds around the cross. Wildflowers, the kind that grow where they're planted and make everything more beautiful just by being there. Sam knelt beside her, helping to cover the seeds with rich, dark earth. She would have liked you, he said simply. When they finished, they stood together in the growing light. Two people who had learned that love didn't end with death, it just changed shape, made room for new growth while honoring what had been. Back at the house, Sam poured 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. Martha hung her apron on the peg beside the blue cavalry coat, and they sat on the front porch to watch their small corner of the world wake up. Hannibal lowed from the south pasture, probably preparing his morning complaints. The chickens began their philosophical discussions about breakfast. Somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird practiced its entire repertoire for an audience of wind and possibility. Martha Brennan and Sam Bridger had found their way to something neither had been looking for. Not romance, not rescue, but something more precious. The quiet grace of 2 hearts learning to beat in the same rhythm. The gentle strength of souls that had been broken and mended stronger at the seams. The blue coat hung patient by the door, witness to miracles small and large, guardian of memories, both bitter and sweet, keeper of the faith that sometimes, when the darkness feels too heavy to bear, morning still comes. In the newly planted earth beside Elizabeth's grave, wildflower seeds settled deep into soil that had been watered with tears and warmed by forgiveness. And everywhere, if you knew how to listen, was the sound of things beginning to grow.